I waited behind the hedgerow while the road stayed open and the orders stayed cautious. My superiors wanted patience, but every unchallenged column made that silence heavier. When I chose to fire, it was not confidence I felt, but responsibility settling in. After the engine stopped, I understood how narrow the line was between obedience and consequence. By mid-July 1944, the fighting in Normandy had settled into a grinding contest of movement measured in fields rather than miles. The Allied landings were more than a month old, the beaches were secure, ports were still contested or damaged, and the German army in the west was fighting to delay a breakout it could no longer fully prevent. The countryside between Saint-Lô and Caumont-Levante was divided by hedgerows, sunken lanes, and narrow farm tracks that restricted visibility and favored defenders who understood the ground. German armored units operating in this sector were under increasing strain. Fuel shortages were common, replacement crews were unevenly trained, and units were frequently reorganized after losses. Panzer columns moved when orders arrived and stopped when roads were blocked or air activity forced concealment. Despite these limitations, German armored doctrine still emphasized offensive maneuver and decisive counterattack. Even in July, senior commanders expected armored formations to move forward aggressively when conditions allowed. Opposing them were American forces that had adapted unevenly to the terrain. Infantry divisions bore the brunt of the hedgerow fighting, while armored units searched for ways to bring firepower to bear without exposing themselves to ambush. Among these formations were the tank destroyer battalions, units created under a doctrine that emphasized mobility and concentrated anti-armor fire rather than head-to-head tank combat. One such unit, equipped with the M10 tank destroyer, had been operating along secondary roads west of Saint-Lô. The M10 was a compromise vehicle. It mounted a 3-inch gun capable of defeating most German tanks at typical combat ranges, but it did so on a chassis with relatively thin armor and an open-topped turret. The design reflected American doctrine rather than battlefield comfort. Crews were expected to move quickly, strike from prepared positions, and withdraw before counterfire could be effectively directed. German tank crews were aware of the M10. Reports from earlier encounters described it as tall, lightly armored, and vulnerable to high explosive fire. Its open turret was noted with particular disdain. German after-action summaries often grouped it with other American self-propelled guns as a secondary threat, dangerous if ignored, but inferior to German tanks in a direct engagement. These assessments filtered down to the front. Panzer crews spoke of the M10 as something to be avoided only briefly, a vehicle that could be suppressed or destroyed if located. The greater concern remained American medium tanks and artillery, along with the constant presence of Allied aircraft. On the American side, the men assigned to the M10s were rarely afforded illusions about their vehicle's limitations. Training emphasized discipline, concealment, and coordination with infantry. They were instructed not to seek combat unless conditions favored them. In Normandy, those conditions were often defined by terrain rather than doctrine. One of the junior officers assigned to this sector was a platoon leader in a tank destroyer battalion attached to an infantry division advancing slowly along a hedgerow-lined road network. His duties were routine and unglamorous. Each morning involved checking the condition of his vehicles, reviewing maps marked with last known enemy positions, and coordinating with infantry officers whose units occupied nearby fields and villages. Much of his time was spent waiting. Orders arrived sporadically, often delayed by broken communications or changing priorities. When movement was required, it was usually short and cautious, from one concealed position to another. The platoon's M10s were camouflaged with branches and netting, positioned behind hedgerows or at the edge of orchards where their guns could cover likely avenues of approach. The officer understood that his role was not to lead in advance, but to respond to German armor when it appeared. This often meant remaining idle while infantry units absorbed pressure or artillery duels played out beyond sight. The tension came not from constant action, but from uncertainty. German armored movements were unpredictable, constrained by fuel and air threat, but capable of sudden concentration. By late July, reports indicated increased German movement along a secondary road that ran through a shallow valley bordered by thick hedgerows and small wooded rises. The road was not a major highway, but served as a connector between larger routes used by German units shifting laterally behind the front. Infantry patrols had noted engine noise at night and the tracks of armored vehicles pressed into soft ground near road junctions. The information was fragmentary. No firm identification of units was available. It was unclear whether the movement represented a supply column, a reconnaissance element, or a preparatory shift for a counterattack. Higher headquarters issued cautious guidance. Tank destroyer units were to remain alert but avoid exposure. Infantry was instructed to maintain observation and report any confirmed armor. For the platoon leader, this meant adjusting positions slightly, improving fields of fire where possible, and rehearsing engagement procedures with his crews. The M10s were repositioned incrementally, their guns aligned with gaps in the hedgerows that overlooked the road at oblique angles. Each adjustment required coordination with infantry units whose foxholes and weapon emplantments were interwoven with the same terrain. The limitations of the M10 were a constant consideration. Its height made concealment difficult. The open turret exposed the crew to mortar fragments, small arms fire, and the elements. Ammunition storage was limited, and resupply in the hedgerows was slow. The vehicle's armor could not withstand repeated hits from German tank guns. At the same time, the terrain offered opportunities. Hedgerows restricted movement and visibility. Vehicles were forced to follow roads or risk becoming immobilized. The thick earthen banks and vegetation provided natural cover for stationary guns, particularly when firing from a flank. German units operating in the area faced their own constraints. Fuel shortages limited prolonged operations. Columns often moved in daylight only when necessary, dispersing under air threat and regrouping in covered areas. Commanders relied on speed and local superiority rather than sustained engagements. Despite this, confidence in German armored superiority remained common at the tactical level. Encounters earlier in the campaign had reinforced the belief that American anti-armor units were most dangerous when massed and prepared, less so when encountered unexpectedly. Individual vehicles were not considered decisive. This assumption influenced movement decisions. Columns traveled with security elements, but often pressed forward to maintain momentum. The risk of delay was weighed against the perceived likelihood of serious opposition. In areas believed to be lightly held, movement was sometimes prioritized over thorough reconnaissance. By the end of the month, the operational picture remained uncertain. American forces were preparing for a broader offensive designed to break through German lines, while German units attempted to stabilize their positions and reposition reserves. The secondary road through the valley continued to draw attention, but no engagement had yet occurred. The platoon leader's routine continued. Maps were updated, crews rotated watch schedules, engines were started periodically to ensure readiness, then shut down to conserve fuel and reduce noise. Infantry patrols passed quietly through the hedgerows, exchanging brief reports before disappearing again. There were early signs that the situation might change. One evening, a forward observer reported fresh track marks on the road, heavier than those of half-tracks or trucks. Another noted that hedgerow gaps previously blocked by debris had been cleared. These observations suggested preparation rather than routine movement. Still, no orders arrived to alter the platoon's role significantly. The M10s remained concealed, their crews alert but inactive. The officer understood that if German armor appeared, there would be little time to adjust. Any engagement would depend on the positions already chosen and the discipline of the crews. The limitations of Doctrine were apparent. Tank destroyer units were intended to operate in coordinated groups against massed armor, yet the realities of Normandy often reduced them to small dispersed elements responding to local threats. Success depended less on theory than on timing and terrain. As night fell, the sounds of the countryside shifted. Artillery fire echoed intermittently in the distance. Engines could be heard and then faded. The road remained empty, but the sense of anticipation grew.
Both sides were maneuvering, constrained by logistics, doctrine, and the ground itself. The situation was unresolved, balanced between movement and concealment, confidence and uncertainty. The conditions for contact were present, but the outcome remained undefined.
By the last week of July 1944, German armored movement in the sector increased in frequency but not in clarity. Reports from infantry units described brief sightings of vehicles moving under tree cover, engines idling in orchards, and columns halting abruptly when Allied aircraft passed overhead. None of these observations produced a confirmed engagement. Instead, they suggested a pattern of cautious advance combined with urgency as German units attempted to reposition without drawing attention. Higher American headquarters interpreted the activity conservatively. Intelligence summaries emphasized the possibility of a limited counterattack, but stopped short of predicting a major armored thrust. Tank destroyer battalions were advised to remain dispersed and responsive, reinforcing infantry rather than massing in reserve. The guidance reflected both the terrain and recent experience, which showed that large armored movements were difficult to conceal in Normandy. For the platoon leader, the operational picture became more complicated rather than clearer. His platoon received fragmented reports from multiple infantry companies, each describing slightly different activity along the same road. Some suggested a small number of vehicles moving at night. Others reported daytime movement under cover of hedgerows. None could confirm unit strength or intent. This uncertainty exposed growing tension between doctrine and observation. Tank destroyer doctrine assumed identifiable enemy armored formations advancing along predictable axes. What the platoon encountered instead was intermittent movement, partial information, and terrain that prevented long-range observation. There was no clear moment at which a massed response could be triggered. Several attempts were made to improve observation. Infantry units pushed listening posts closer to the road. A forward observer was repositioned to a small rise overlooking a bend in the valley. Each effort produced more detail, but no decisive confirmation. Tracks were heavier now, clearly from tanks rather than lighter vehicles. Ruts cut deeply into the soft ground at the road's edge, indicating repeated passage. At the same time, American infantry in the area experienced mounting pressure. Small arms fire increased along the hedgerow lines. Mortar rounds fell intermittently, probing rather than preparatory. These actions suggested German forces were testing defenses rather than committing to an attack. Tank destroyer crews remained in their positions, but the strain of waiting intensified. Vehicles were checked repeatedly. Ammunition was redistributed to ensure each M10 carried a balanced load. Communication lines were tested and retested as radio reliability was inconsistent in the hedgerows. German units, for their part, faced their own difficulties. Fuel shortages limited flexibility. Orders from higher command emphasized holding ground and delaying Allied advances, but provided little guidance on how to reconcile that goal with the realities of Allied air superiority and artillery dominance. Local commanders were forced to make decisions based on incomplete information and immediate pressures. Within German armored formations, confidence remained uneven. Some crews had experienced recent losses and were cautious. Others, particularly those with prior success against American units, retained a belief in their qualitative superiority. Reports circulated that American tank destroyers were present in the area, but these were often described as isolated or poorly positioned. This perception influenced movement along the road. Columns advanced with spacing, but not with the degree of reconnaissance that Doctrine recommended for close terrain. Security elements were present, but their focus was on infantry threats rather than concealed anti-armor positions. The assumption persisted that American tank destroyers would reveal themselves through movement or firing, providing an opportunity for rapid suppression. The platoon leader observed these developments through second-hand reports and the subtle signs left on the ground. He noted that German movement appeared more deliberate, with pauses at specific junctions and hedgerow gaps. This suggested coordination rather than routine transit. He relayed his assessment upward, emphasizing that the road was likely being used as a primary route rather than an incidental one. The response was measured. He was instructed to maintain readiness but avoid engagement unless a clear opportunity presented itself.
The guidance reflected a concern about exposing limited assets prematurely. Tank destroyers were not to engage unless they could do so from a position of advantage. This caution, while understandable, also constrained initiative. The platoon's positions had been selected to cover likely approaches, but the exact moment of engagement would depend on enemy movement aligning precisely with those fields of fire. There was little margin for adjustment once contact occurred. As days passed, the German column movements began to show a pattern. Activity increased at dawn and again in late afternoon, periods when air threat was reduced. Vehicles moved in short bursts, stopping under cover, then proceeding. Each movement appeared purposeful, directed toward a junction deeper in the valley. American infantry units reported that German vehicles were using the road not only to move forward, but to reposition laterally, suggesting an attempt to reinforce or relieve units under pressure elsewhere. This made the road more significant than previously assumed. Despite these indicators, no engagement occurred. German units passed through the area without encountering resistance, or at least without triggering a response from the tank destroyer platoon. This reinforced German confidence and American frustration. Each unopposed movement increased the likelihood that the road would be used again. Within the platoon, discussions became more focused on the limitations of existing positions. Some hedgerow gaps provided only narrow fields of fire. Others were masked by slight rises in the road that concealed approaching vehicles until they were very close. Adjusting positions would require movement during daylight, increasing the risk of detection. The platoon leader weighed these factors carefully. He was aware that Doctrine discouraged unilateral repositioning without orders, particularly in a fluid situation. At the same time, the evidence suggested that German units were becoming more comfortable using the road, perhaps assuming that American anti-armor assets were absent or ineffective. The tension between adherence to orders and responsiveness to conditions grew more pronounced. The platoon leader submitted another report, noting that repeated German movements without opposition were likely to embolden further use of the route. He suggested that a prepared engagement from concealed positions could disrupt this pattern. The reply acknowledged the assessment, but reiterated caution. Tank destroyers were to conserve strength for decisive moments. The implication was clear. Engagement should occur only when the presence of enemy armor was unmistakable and the opportunity significant. This guidance reflected broader concerns. American commanders were wary of committing specialized assets in piecemeal fashion. Losses earlier in the campaign had shown that tank destroyers, when misused, could be destroyed quickly. Preserving them for larger engagements was a priority. On the ground, however, the distinction between decisive and incremental engagement was blurred. German movements along the road were not dramatic, but they were persistent. Each passage represented fuel, equipment, and personnel repositioned under cover, contributing to German resilience. The platoon leader's frustration was tempered by discipline. He maintained his positions, adjusted camouflage, and ensured that crews remained alert. He understood that any engagement would be sudden and brief, leaving little room for correction. The first signs of failure appeared not in combat but in missed opportunity. One afternoon, infantry observers reported a small group of German vehicles moving along the road, including at least one tank. The report arrived after the vehicles had already passed beyond the platoon's effective coverage. The M10s remained silent, their guns trained on empty road. This incident highlighted the gap between observation and action. Information arrived too late, or without sufficient detail to justify engagement. The road continued to function as a corridor for German movement. As July drew to a close, the operational problem was no longer theoretical. German armored units were using the road with increasing regularity. American forces were aware of it, but constrained by caution and doctrine. The tank destroyer platoon remained in place, prepared but not used. The situation was stable but unsatisfactory. Both sides were operating under assumptions that had not yet been tested directly. The ground, the road, and the vehicles involved were unchanged. What remained uncertain was how long this balance could be maintained.
In early August 1944, the operational tempo in the sector shifted subtly but decisively. American infantry pressure increased along adjacent fronts and artillery fire became more frequent and better coordinated. German units responded by moving reserves more actively, attempting to seal gaps and reinforce threatened positions. The secondary road through the valley, once used cautiously, became a routine axis of movement. For the tank destroyer platoon, this change was evident in the rhythm of reports. Infantry observers now reported vehicle movement almost daily. Tracks overlapped older ruts, and roadside vegetation was crushed flat, indicating repeated passage by heavy vehicles. The road was no longer incidental, it was being relied upon. The platoon leader recognized that the situation had reached a point where continued inaction carried its own risks. Each unopposed movement strengthened German confidence and reduced the likelihood that future movements would be conducted with caution. The road's predictability, once a constraint, now presented an opportunity. He began a careful reassessment of his platoon's positions. Without altering the overall disposition, he examined minor adjustments that could be made under cover of darkness or during periods of low visibility. These changes were incremental rather than doctrinally bold. Guns were re-angled slightly, camouflage was improved where foliage had thinned, range markers were discreetly placed to aid rapid target acquisition. This was not a formal retasking of the platoon, but it reflected a growing realization that doctrine alone could not dictate action in the hedgerows. The tank destroyers were unlikely to encounter a massed armored assault. What they faced instead was a steady flow of vehicles using constrained terrain. The conditions favored ambush rather than maneuver. The platoon leader communicated these observations to his immediate superior, framing them carefully. He emphasized that German movement patterns suggested complacency rather than caution. He argued that a limited engagement, conducted from concealment and terminated quickly, could disrupt this pattern without exposing the platoon to prolonged combat. The response was cautious but less restrictive than before. While no explicit authorization for an engagement was issued, the emphasis shifted toward readiness to act if circumstances were favorable. The language was imprecise, reflecting the uncertainty at higher levels about how best to employ tank destroyers in this environment. This ambiguity placed responsibilities squarely on the platoon leader. Any decision to engage would be judged after the fact, based on results rather than intent. Success would validate initiative, failure would raise questions about judgment and adherence to orders. The risk became personal, not because of ambition, but because of accountability. The platoon leader understood that his decisions would directly affect the survival of his crews. The M10's vulnerabilities were well known. A misjudged engagement could result in rapid losses. German armored units continued to move along the road with increasing regularity. Observers reported that vehicles often traveled in columns of mixed types, including tanks, self-propelled guns, and support vehicles. Spacing was maintained, but not at the level expected in hostile terrain. Halts were brief, security elements were minimal. Within German units, the repeated lack of opposition reinforced existing assumptions. American tank destroyers were known to be present somewhere in the sector, but their absence along this road suggested either redeployment or ineffectiveness. The M10, already regarded with limited respect, was not considered a decisive threat. This perception influenced behavior. Columns moved with engines running continuously, reducing the likelihood of rapid dispersion. Vehicles remained on the road rather than dispersing into adjacent fields, trusting speed and momentum over concealment. For the platoon leader, these behaviors were indicators rather than provocations. He observed them through reports, not direct sight, but the pattern was consistent. The road had become predictable in both use and timing. German movements clustered around specific periods of the day when air threat was reduced and visibility sufficient. The platoon prepared accordingly. Crews rehearsed engagement drills quietly, without live firing. Each gunner reviewed assigned sectors. Drivers memorized withdrawal routes that led into concealed lanes or behind thicker hedgerows. The emphasis was on precision and brevity. One position in particular drew increased attention. It overlooked a slight bend in the road, where vehicles were forced to slow and align themselves after negotiating a shallow depression. From this angle, a vehicle's flank would be exposed briefly before the road straightened again.
The hedgerow at this point was thick and elevated, providing concealment and a stable firing platform. The position was not ideal in every respect. Fields of fire were limited, and the M10's height made complete concealment difficult. However, the angle offered the possibility of a first-round hit against a vulnerable section of a vehicle's side armor. The platoon leader considered this position carefully. Engaging from there would require restraint. Only a small portion of a column could be engaged before the remainder reacted. Withdrawal would need to be immediate and coordinated. There would be no opportunity to reposition under fire. The decision was not formalized in orders, but the intent was understood within the platoon. If a German column appeared and conditions matched the rehearsed scenario, engagement would be initiated from that position. The criteria were clear: limited numbers, clear identification, and favorable angle. This understanding marked a shift from passive readiness to conditional initiative. It did not violate orders explicitly, but it relied on interpretation rather than instruction. The platoon leader accepted this responsibility quietly, without discussion beyond what was necessary for preparation. German movement continued. One morning, observers reported a column halted briefly near the bend, then proceeded. The M10s remained silent. The platoon leader judged the conditions unsuitable. The column was too dispersed, and the angle was partially masked. Later that day, another report described vehicles moving in closer formation, but visibility was poor due to haze. Again, no engagement occurred. Each decision reinforced discipline and restraint, even as tension increased. The turning point came not with a dramatic signal, but with a convergence of routine indicators. Tracks were fresh, engine noise was reported consistently. Infantry observers noted that German vehicles were no longer stopping to reconnoiter the bend. They slowed, aligned, and moved on without pause. This behavior suggested confidence bordering on assumption. The road was being treated as safe. The platoon leader reviewed the situation one final time. The position was prepared. Crews were alert. Communications were functioning. The conditions he had outlined were increasingly likely to be met. The risk was no longer abstract. Any engagement would expose his platoon to immediate counterfire and potential reprisal, yet continued inaction would undermine German efforts elsewhere. The balance between caution and initiative had narrowed. The next German movement along the road would force a decision, whether by engagement or by deliberate restraint. The platoon waited, concealed and silent, as the operational problem moved toward resolution.
The German column entered the valley shortly after midday, moving at a steady pace that suggested routine rather than urgency. Vehicles emerged from the tree line in sequence, engines audible well before they came into view. The lead elements slowed slightly at the bend in the road, aligned themselves, and continued forward without halting. There was no visible attempt at reconnaissance beyond the road itself. From the concealed positions along the hedgerow, the tank destroyer crews observed silently. Range estimates were confirmed. The platoon leader monitored the column's composition as it became clearer. Armored vehicles mixed with support elements, spaced but not dispersed. The movement matched the conditions that had been anticipated and rehearsed. The decision to engage was made without formal announcement. It followed directly from the criteria the platoon had already accepted. The lead vehicles passed beyond the optimal angle, and the next armored vehicle entered the narrow window of exposure at the bend. At that moment, the platoon leader authorized fire. The first shot struck the vehicle's flank. The impact was visible immediately, followed by smoke and a brief halt in the column's movement. A second shot followed from another position, aimed at a different vehicle attempting to maneuver. The engagement was brief and tightly controlled. Crews fired only when targets were clearly presented, avoiding rapid expenditure of ammunition. German reaction was swift but disorganized. Vehicles behind the damaged ones halted abruptly, creating congestion on the narrow road. Some attempted to reverse, while others edged forward uncertainly. Return fire began almost immediately, directed toward the hedgerow but without precise target identification. The M10 crews did not remain exposed. After firing a limited number of rounds, they executed their withdrawal drills as practiced.
Engines were started, and vehicles reversed into concealed lanes, disappearing behind thicker cover before German fire could be effectively adjusted. The entire engagement lasted only minutes. It was not a prolonged firefight, nor was it intended to be. Its purpose was disruption rather than destruction, and in that respect it succeeded. The German column was halted, its movement broken, and its assumption of safety along the road abruptly challenged. From the American perspective, the immediate outcome was measured rather than celebratory. No attempt was made to pursue or re-engage. The platoon leader prioritized repositioning and concealment, anticipating retaliation in the form of artillery or renewed armored probes. Crews checked their vehicles quickly for damage and confirmed ammunition status. German units responded cautiously. After an initial period of confusion, surviving vehicles attempted to disperse from the road where possible. Infantry elements dismounted and moved into the hedgerows, probing for the source of fire. Artillery support was requested, but coordination took time. In the hours that followed, German movement along the road ceased. Vehicles remained concealed off the route, and no further attempts were made to pass through the valley that day. The disruption extended beyond the immediate engagement, forcing German commanders to reconsider their assumptions about the area's security. At higher American headquarters, reports of the engagement were received with interest and scrutiny. The action had not been part of a planned operation, and its scope was limited. Nevertheless, it achieved a tangible effect with minimal loss. The question was not whether the engagement was tactically sound, but whether it aligned with broader doctrine and command intent. The platoon leader submitted his after-action report carefully, emphasizing adherence to guidance regarding concealment, limited exposure, and rapid withdrawal. He framed the engagement as a response to repeated enemy movement and an exploitation of favorable terrain, rather than as an initiative driven by opportunity alone. The response from superiors was restrained. There was no immediate commendation, nor was there criticism. Instead, the engagement was analyzed alongside other recent actions, contributing to an ongoing reassessment of how tank destroyer units were being employed in Normandy. For German commanders, the incident carried a different weight. The road could no longer be considered safe for routine movement. Additional reconnaissance would be required, slowing operations and increasing vulnerability to air and artillery attack. The assumption that American tank destroyers were either absent or ineffective in the area had been disproven. The consequences of the engagement extended beyond the vehicles damaged or halted. It altered behavior. Subsequent German movements avoided the valley or were conducted with greater caution, reducing the efficiency of lateral repositioning. This, in turn, affected the ability to respond quickly to pressure elsewhere along the front. From the platoon itself, it remained in place, but its role had subtly changed. It was no longer merely a potential response force. Its presence, once unproven, was now established. The crews understood that future engagements would likely be met with quicker and more coordinated opposition. Authority responded with neither immediate rebuke nor praise, but with adjustment. Tank destroyer units in similar terrain were encouraged to report patterns of enemy movement more aggressively and to prepare for limited engagements when conditions favored them. Doctrine was not rewritten, but its application became more flexible. The stakes, however, remained high. Any future action would be judged against the precedents set here. The margin for error had narrowed. Initiative had been demonstrated, and with it came expectation. The ambush had stopped a column, but it had also drawn attention. Both sides adjusted accordingly, and the quiet balance that followed was shaped by the knowledge that assumptions had limits, and that even lightly armored vehicles, used precisely, could impose consequences.
In the days following the engagement, the Valley Road remained unused by German armored units. Reconnaissance patrols appeared intermittently, probing hedgerows and intersections, but no column attempted to move through the area with the same confidence as before. When vehicles did appear, they did so cautiously, often halting well short of the bend that had become associated with loss and disruption. American infantry units noted the change quickly. German lateral movement slowed, forcing reliance on longer, less direct routes that were more exposed to Allied air observation and artillery interdiction. The effect was not dramatic, but it was cumulative. Small delays compounded into operational friction at a time when German forces could least afford inefficiency. The tank destroyer platoon remained deployed in the same general sector, though individual positions were adjusted periodically. Artillery fire fell on suspected locations, but without effect. The M10s were moved only at night or under cover of weather, maintaining concealment while avoiding predictable patterns. No further engagement occurred along that stretch of road. At battalion and regimental levels, the ambush was incorporated into broader assessments of tank destroyer employment in Normandy. Reports emphasized that the engagement had succeeded not because of vehicle superiority, but because of terrain exploitation, fire discipline, and restraint. The open-topped M10, often criticized for its vulnerability, had performed effectively when used within its limitations. German after-action reports from the period reflected a reassessment of assumptions. While specific references to the engagement were limited, there was a noticeable shift in how secondary roads were evaluated. Increased emphasis was placed on reconnaissance and infantry screening, even in areas previously considered low risk. This adjustment consumed time and resources, further constraining already stretched units. The platoon leader did not receive public recognition for the action. His report was filed, analyzed, and absorbed into routine operational records. There was no citation or formal commendation. This was consistent with the nature of the engagement, which had been tactically sound but operationally modest. Its value lay in its effect rather than its visibility. Within the platoon, the outcome reinforced confidence tempered by realism. Crews understood that success had depended on specific conditions unlikely to be replicated easily. There was no sense of triumph, only confirmation that careful preparation and disciplined execution could offset material disadvantages. As Allied forces achieved their broader breakout later in August, the fighting moved rapidly beyond the valley. The road that had once carried German columns became part of a rear area, its significance fading as the front advanced eastward. The engagement there was overtaken by larger events, absorbed into the flow of the campaign. Institutionally, the episode contributed quietly to an evolving understanding of armored warfare in close terrain. Tank destroyer doctrine was not abandoned, but its application became more pragmatic. Emphasis shifted toward decentralized decision-making and responsiveness to local conditions, lessons reinforced by numerous similar actions across Normandy. The M10 itself would soon be supplemented and replaced by newer designs, its service in Europe relatively brief. Yet its crew's experiences informed future training and doctrine, underscoring the importance of judgment over rigid adherence to theory. The legacy of the ambush was not one of dramatic reversal or decisive victory. It was an example of how assumptions once challenged required adjustment. German confidence in routine movement along that road was broken. American caution gave way, briefly and precisely, to initiative. Such actions rarely dominate histories of the campaign. They appear only in reports, maps marked with pencil lines, and the recollections of those directly involved. Yet they shaped behavior, constrained options, and contributed incrementally to the larger outcome. In the measured progress of the Normandy campaign, the halted column became one of many small disruptions that, taken together, eroded German capacity to respond. Its significance lay not in spectacle, but in demonstration, that even a vehicle often dismissed by its opponents could impose real cost when employed with care.